Hello, my name is Jen, and welcome back to my little corner of YouTube. Today, I'm going to be answering a question that many of you have asked a lot in my comment section. What the heck do you do with waste that you generate from electroforming? When you do any sort of electroforming, or gold, silver, or rhodium plating, you are going to generate some waste that you will need to dispose of at some point. Doing that properly is super important so you don't pour something harmful down the drain or into the environment. If you work with dangerous chemicals or acids, you do have the responsibility to make sure that you dispose of them properly. Unfortunately, I don't currently have any waste to really show you the process right this second, but so many of you have asked that I'm going to talk you through the process and explain what I do as a small business. First, please make sure that you do look into your local state laws and even your city laws, because they can vary greatly by state or even by city. So if you go on Reddit or Google and you try to look up how to dispose of electroforming waste, you're going to get a lot of very vague suggestions and not a lot of answers. And basically what everyone does say is just contact your local hazardous waste facility, which it's a lot easier said than done. So hopefully I can kind of provide a little bit of guidance for you here on how to go about that and what hazardous waste disposal kind of looks like. Now, since most of us in the small business world are considered more of a hobbyist, we're probably not generating a lot of hazardous waste, but you might have a little bit. Or if you are, leaving the hobby, if you're leaving the business, you don't want to electroform anymore, you just have a lot of solution you need to get rid of because your solution went bad. This is kind of how you're going to go about doing it. And luckily for us, since we're not a commercial facility, this hopefully shouldn't be as complex of a process as it seems to be when you Google how to dispose of hazardous waste. So one of the most important things is to know exactly what is in your waste, what part of it is hazardous, so that you know how to dispose of it properly. This video, I'm going to go over specifically copper electroforming. So if you play anything else, that might be a little bit different. So just please make sure you do your own research into that. So for copper electroforming, if you haven't made your own solution and instead have bought the Midas Rio Grande solution, then that will come with an SDS, or a safety data sheet, which kind of tells you a lot of what you need to know about what's in it and what's toxic and how it affects you in the environment. The SDS will show that it contains copper sulfate and sulfuric acid. Once the solution has been used to electroform, it'll actually contain even more dissolved copper, which is highly toxic. And the SDS does specifically tell you that you need to dispose of the waste properly and that you should retain any contaminated washing water and also dispose of that properly as well. So we're going to actually talk about that second part first. So the easiest part of the process is the disposal of the distilled water that you're using to rinse off your piece, which is the contaminated washing water. Now, personally, when I electroform, I will rinse my pieces from the solution in distilled water, usually distilled water mixed with baking soda, and I use a shallow Tupperware or sometimes just like a little plastic cup for my distilled water. Now, the key is I don't use a lot of distilled water. I use the bare minimum, and the reason for that is I dispose of the washing water through evaporation. So I will always leave that either Tupperware or the cup of water just out and just leave it on my electroforming shelf here. And over time, it will evaporate. It might take a few days sometimes or a week or two, but it evaporates down here. And you can also kind of force it to evaporate by putting it on like a hot plate, like a heater, just to make it evaporate a little bit faster, especially if it's cold in your workshop or it's in the winter. Now, if there are any harmful contaminants in that distilled water, what's going to happen is that they will become solid precipitants. And that solid waste can then be disposed of multiple different ways. But that way you have reduced what could be several ounces of water down to maybe a couple grams of solid waste. The key in hazardous waste disposal is also to have as little of it as possible. Now, the alternate method is also using more distilled water, but you use the same distilled water over and over and over and over again until that distilled water has become a very diluted electroforming solution, just because of how much solution is in there. And then you would just follow the rules for disposing of it as if you would dispose regular solution. My personal method for disposing of waste is to basically just have as little of it as possible so I don't have to deal with it. You can do that multiple ways. So my favorite methods that I use are cementation and evaporation. We've already talked about evaporation. The other method is called cementation, and cementation is a relatively simple and kind of cost-effective way to recover copper from your solutions. And basically what I'm doing is taking a more reactive metal than copper and putting it into my solution so that the copper ions cement to that metal. In this case, what you want to do is use something like iron. the copper will cement to the iron. And the easiest way to get the dissolved copper out of your solution, which is highly toxic, and turn it into a solid like elemental copper is by using steel wool pads. Now, steel wool pads are made predominantly from iron and carbon and a couple other like little elements, which makes a steel alloy. And what this does is when you put this in a copper solution in, like, say, your beaker, it will start turning copper colored. That means the copper ions are leaching out of the solution and cementing right onto the iron here. And the reason you want to use steel wool is because it has a lot of surface area. With how thin this is, it has an absolute ton of surface area. And you can just get these like steel wool pads like anywhere in Walmart or wherever. I'm gonna throw a link down to the Amazon. Now, this might not take 100% of the dissolved copper out of your solution, but it'll take a good amount of it. And then since you now have the copper in a steel wool pad, you can eventually, reuse that copper for something if you want to in some way, or just recycle it. Now, if for some reason there is something wrong with a small portion of my solution, or I think there's something going wrong with my solution, what I may try to do is allow it to evaporate as much as possible. And I have done that in the past with some very, very small batches of solution that went bad when I was testing them, is I basically just let it sit in a very hot area for a few days, I think even a few weeks, until the solution had evaporated, and instead there was just solid like blue crystals left behind, which is the just precipitants of the solution, and that is the toxic material. Now, those blue crystals that you end up with, they can be reused in another solution because they can be thrown into heated water, and that they can actually reconstitute back into an electroforming solution. I did make a video on how to reuse the blue crystals and make them back into solutions so you don't have to throw them away. That is a possibility, especially if you plan to still keep electroforming. You can just keep those and store them instead of treating them as waste. Now, another waste product that you'll generate is the filter papers. You will get dirty filter papers when you're filtering your solution. And again, what I do is I allow them to fully dry out so that way there's no liquid at all, and they're treated as waste then, as well as any, like, say, shop towels for spills and stuff like that too. Again, that's all considered hazardous waste. Also, if you use like vermiculite or kitty litter or any sawdust or anything to mop up like a bigger spill, that would also be considered hazardous waste in this business. So now you will have two types of waste. First is your solid waste. That is the things like your blue crystals, your dirty filter papers, or any, again, absorbent material that you had used to mop up the spills. And at times you may also have liquid waste, and liquid waste is a little bit harder to dispose of. So there are several rules to remember with hazardous waste. One is label it properly. If you are doing multiple different kinds of plating, then you do want to make sure that you have the different types of waste labeled separately so that you don't mix them. You never want to mix waste because, one, that can be dangerous for you and makes it much harder to dispose of properly. The second rule is to make sure you always store your waste in proper containers. So these are HPDE containers. You can get HPDE number 2 or PP number 5. Those are specific types of containers you want to use to store any types of waste, especially acid-based waste. If you have any other type of waste, you might have to research what you need to store it in. But when taking it to like a waste facility, you want to make sure it's in a proper container and it's labeled. I'll link a few containers down below too. And the third rule is kind of more for if you really generate a lot of waste, but if you do generate a lot of waste, you also want to kind of keep a log of your waste, how much you generate, how frequently, just in case of any inspections or regulations down the line, especially if you get involved with the process that I'm going to explain. Now, the hard part is the actual waste disposal. So you have your waste, you have it stored properly, you have it labeled. How do you get rid of it? And if you go online and you Google how to get rid of electroforming waste, you're not really going to get a lot of good answers. And the truth is, there is no easy answer. And that is because the rules for getting rid of waste vary depending on the state and the city you live in. They really depend on the local ordinances. Now, personally, I'm not going to tell you where I live, but I will tell you the state. So I am in PA, and I'm going to show you the regulations for my state. You can use a similar method of searching to get the regulations for your state. Now, I'm going to kind of walk you through some of my Google searches and how I found the information and how I apply that to my own business. Let's say I live in Philly. I'm going to Google, how do I dispose of plating solution in Philadelphia, PA? Now, if you are a hobbyist, more than likely you may be able to follow the household hazardous waste regulations. They're the easiest ones to follow, and that is meant for pretty much the everyday household that generates, a little bit of waste. I believe the EPA says that almost every household generates roughly about the average of 4 pounds of hazardous household waste. I know in the years that I've been electroforming, I've probably have barely generated a pound across several years of electroforming. The only time I think I would really generate a lot of waste is if I was trying to leave the business and get rid of all of my solution, which in that case, if you're really trying to get rid of all your solution and your solution is still good, you might be able to find another electroformer that would want it. So that's always the first avenue to look for, is how can you sell it if it's good or pass it on to someone else who could use it. Now, if you can follow the hazardous household waste rules, then the best thing is to just Google your local municipality or city or whatever and see when is the next household hazardous waste collection time. I believe some states might do it monthly, some quarterly. I don't think they do it very frequently, but usually they do happen at a specific interval so that people can get rid of their waste. But I'm also going to go over if you generate a significant amount of waste or if the household waste event is not an option for you. So if you generate a significant amount of waste, you may need to kind of go the most commercial route of waste disposal. And the first thing you have to do is determine what your generator status is according to the EPA. So there are 3 categories. You have the very small quantity generator, which means that you generate less than 220 pounds of waste per month, and that translates to about 27 gallons. The next category is the small quantity generator, which is between 220 pounds and 2,200 pounds per month. And then you have the large quantity generator, which is more than 2,200 pounds per month. If you generate that much, then I don't know what you're doing here watching this video, because you have a commercial-based business and you should already have a plan in place to dispose of your hazardous waste. Now, after you determine what category of waste generator you are, then you need to figure out if you need an EPA ID. Now, in most states, it seems that if you are a very small quantity generator, you don't need an EPA ID, but it does seem like there are exceptions to the rule. So just check your state guidelines. Now, if you need to get an EPA ID, you have to go online and fill out a bunch of paperwork and apply for that. This does put you in a whole new category of regulation where you have to have a lot more records and logging, and it's a lot more strict. So just make sure you read up on the rules, and you can get all of those rules from the EPA website. So that information is out there. It just might be a little bit more difficult to put in place. Now, for the most part, electroformers are small businesses, and going just based on my own business model, I don't think many of us generate more than 220 pounds of waste per month. So I'm going to assume that most of us are in the very small quantity generator category. Very small quantity generators have to comply with 3 basic waste management requirements to remain exempt from the full hazardous waste regulation. And those are identifying all hazardous waste that you generate, not storing more than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste on site at any time, and ensuring delivery of your hazardous waste to a proper waste disposal facility or treatment facility. Now, certain states do treat very small quantity generators a bit differently. So again, just make sure that your state does allow you to just follow these 3 requirements, and that way you don't have to fall under the regulations of the small quantity or large quantity generators. Now, in my state, I'm pretty lucky where I do fall under those requirements, and I don't need to get an EPA ID or go through any of the other paperwork or hassle when it comes to hazardous waste disposal. You're staying in the video. Now, from my research, in most states, you can take your hazardous waste to your facility yourself, especially if you're a very small quantity generator. If you do have a lot of waste for some reason, then you may need to have it transported to a facility by a licensed transporter. It does seem like if you are a small quantity or large quantity generator, that you do have to use the transporter. And again, some states do even require very small quantity generators to still use a licensed transporter to get your hazardous waste to a disposal facility. Now, to find a waste disposal facility, you just kind of have to Google it. There are several commercial businesses in most industrialized areas, especially if you're around a larger city, that will have that. A lot of businesses do generate waste that you don't even realize. So there is usually at least one somewhere in your area. Now, there is a cost to dispose of that waste, and that will vary depending on what facility you go to, or if it is a commercial facility, or if it's some kind of local, state-run, government-run facility. Now, hopefully to make your life easier, you just fall under the very small quantity generator, and And realistically, if you have a very, very minimal amount of hazardous waste, then you might be able to just dispose of it through the Household Hazardous Waste program. Now, not every area has one of these programs. So now when I was doing my own research, I did find that in PA, if there is not a Household Hazardous Waste program near me, or the time frame is too great in between collection events and I need to dispose of hazardous waste, there are a couple different things you can do. So in PA, we are allowed to actually dispose of a minuscule amount of hazardous waste in our trash, provided that we're following the following things. First, dispose of any hazardous waste according to the label. So it may even tell you how to dispose of it, what to neutralize it with. In this case, if you have electroforming solution and you do need to neutralize anything, you can use something like baking soda to neutralize the acid in the solution. Make sure there is no liquid in whatever you're disposing of. Just make sure you allow all the liquid to evaporate so that you just have some kind of solid waste. And then you want to carefully package that waste very tightly so that it does not leak into anything else, doesn't leak into any other trash, and just dispose of very, very minimal amounts in your trash. If you have a lot of it and you have to dispose of it in the trash, just make sure maybe spread it out in smaller quantities throughout several collection cycles in your trash. So for me, the most common disposal of things like used filter papers or say shop towels that were used to clean up spills, this is where I would allow them to fully dry out so there's no liquid, and then bag them up very, very tightly, sometimes in multiple bags, to dispose of them in just my local trash, just because it might be, 2 little filter papers, which to try to dispose of that through a whole hazardous waste facility, a little laughable. I don't even know if they would take that. So now personally, I also try to have almost little to no waste so that I don't have to deal with the hassle and headache of going through this whole program. It is a lot. So I've been electroforming for several years, and because I tend to mostly use just evaporation to get rid of any kind of solution that I don't want, I really haven't had to deal with the hazardous waste disposal. If you're getting into electroforming as a hobby or as a business, it is possible to run it in a way that you don't have to worry about disposing of a lot of hazardous waste. Unless, again, you are trying to leave the business and you have a lot of solution that you need to get rid of suddenly. In fact, I just realized I actually am still using the original solution that I have bought from Rio Grande, along with pretty much all of the solution that I have made over the years. So that's all currently in my larger setup. Also, if you do want to see how to actually make your own electroforming solution, check out this video up here. Now, ideally, if you maintain your bath chemistry, you should be able to use your electroforming solution for years and years and years, and simply just add distilled water as the water evaporates from it. And dealing with this hazardous waste disposal process is why so many electroformers spend hours and hours, days and weeks just trying to fix their solution rather than dispose of them. That's why there is a very, very, very long Reddit forum on how to fix your electroforming solution. But again, if you do have to dispose of it, while disposal is a hassle, you do want to make sure that you do it properly so that you don't dump anything down the drain where it will leach into your city's water supply potentially, or anywhere into the soil where it can affect animals, or say if you have a garden or anything that would contaminate your soil very badly. And then you definitely can't grow anything there. So I hope this video has cleared up some questions about how to dispose of electroforming waste. There is a lot of mystery surrounding it just because the laws are so complex and they vary so much by state and even by city. You have your federal EPA guidelines for how to dispose of it, and then usually have your state Department of Environmental Protection, your DEP guidelines too. And again, sometimes even cities impose their own guidelines on how to dispose of waste. So there is just an endless amount of regulations surrounding this. Now, while some regulation is good, it unfortunately causes this massive amount of confusion where people are just posting on Reddit how to get rid of it and someone else is telling you to dump it down the sink. Please don't do that. That's not good for it. So if you like learning about electroforming, silversmithing, or how to use a laser glow forward, please don't forget to hit that subscribe, click the like button, and ring the notification bell. I'll see you at the next one.